So as we look back on the last 50 years, we are very fortunate that we have two of our very senior, seasoned folks that are going to tell us about their journey with DHEC. And so it's a pleasure for me to first introduce the man who needs no introduction, Henry Gibson. Henry got a BS in chemistry from Wofford, and then he went on to the University of Oklahoma, where he got his master's in environmental science. Henry has served the citizens of this state in an environmental capacity for 60 years. And I asked him what his favorite program was, and he laughed and he said he had to say AC, which is where he is now. We know him as a DHEC legend, but I think Henry's biggest legacy that he is proud of is his 4 daughters and his 5 grandchildren. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Henry.
What a pleasure it is to be with you here on the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act and to go over some things that have taken place during my career here at DHEC, the Board of Health, the Pollution Control Authority. I started to work in January of '62 with the Pollution Control Authority. Now that authority was started in 1950. The Pollution Control Act, which we still have today, was also passed by the legislature during that period of time. When I came on board, there were 19 people. You had a director, assistant director, 3 engineers, 6 chemists, 4 water sample takers, a lab tech, 1 secretary, 2 stenographers, and that constituted the 19 people. We also had a board, 9-member board, made up of the following: 1 from the Textile Manufacturers Association, 1 from the Wildlife Federation, 1 from Pulp and Paper, 1 from the Municipal Association, 1 from Farmers, 2 from Labor, 2 from Health, and the technical advisor and the state health officer was an official member. So that constituted the board that we operated under at that time. Also, we had 6 laboratories. 1 was located at the Clemson College Coastal Experiment Station in Somerville, 1 in Lancaster, 1 in Florence, 1 in Greenville. The shellfish section had the mobile lab, and the radiological laboratory was located on the premises of the Opportunity School in West Columbia. So when I went to work, Mr. Linton had a vacancy in Florence, and I went to that laboratory and served there until 1968 when I went to graduate school. Also, to be hired back then, you had to take a merit system exam. I don't know how many of you in here have taken a merit system exam, but you got your name on the list and you could be chosen from that list, but you had a score, and it was a general knowledge type examination with chemists and biologists, engineers, secretaries, and so forth had to take a merit system exam. Also, in 1960, let me just share with you a little bit about Columbia and Charleston, the 2 major cities in South Carolina. And at that time, population in Richland County was a little over 200,000. City of Columbia had a population of a little over 97,000. Charleston County had a population a little over 216,000, and the city of Charleston about 76,000. The reason I mention that is both of those cities were discharging raw waste at that time. Now, I have here an original copy of a letter that one of our staff members on the authority wrote to the executive director. And it's dated July the 8th, 1968. And it goes as follows. It says the attached list of towns and cities are discharging untreated or partially treated sewage to the surface water in South Carolina. The entire list fails to meet the requirements in paragraph 3, section 2 of the Water Classifications Standard System for adequate waste disposal. Most of the entries on this list appear in the latest annual report, and they are contributing over 65 million gallons of untreated or partially treated waste now being discharged. The purpose of this list was to try to get the authority to put these cities and these towns, and I have a list of each one of them here, under an order to put in waste treatment. Now, back then, cities and towns could apply for grants from HUD, from FHA, or EDA, and they could also get some money from Public Law 660, but they would only get a partial amount. So getting monies back then from another source was very difficult. Consequently, you didn't have a whole lot of waste treatment plants being built. Now, in that year, 1962, the year that I went to work, the authority issued 17 municipal discharge permits, 7 industrial discharge permits, and 87 other type permits. Now, leave that and let's fast forward to 1969. Ann has already mentioned about the Cuyahoga fire, the Santa Barbara oil spill, but there was a book. Rachel Carson wrote this book called A Silent Spring in 1962. And that book focused on the negative effects of chemical pesticides. And those 3 things heightened and inspired people to set up the first Earth Day in 1970. So 1970 was a very important date for environmental movement. Approximately 20 million people participated in the first Earth Day. But also in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was established. That was the second thing. Third thing was NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, was created to monitor the conditions of the oceans. So those 2 agencies were established in 1970. Let's move on to 1970. The Pollution Control Authority was further reorganized on April the 29th of 1970 with the approval of the Pollution Control Act of 1970. It further delineated the functions and duties of the authority. Also, we became a separate state agency because at that time, the authority up until 1970 was a division under the State Board of Health. So the authority became a separate state agency on July the 1st, 1971, and remained that way for approximately 2 years. And then the legislature or the governor merged the Pollution Control Authority with the Board of Health into what we now have as DHEC. Now, let's go back and look a little bit on the federal side. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948 was the first major law to address water pollution. And the concern for controlling water pollution led to sweeping amendments in 1972. You probably don't remember, but Senator Edmund Muskie from Maine introduced a bill called Senate Bill 2770 to amend the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. The bill passed in the Senate almost unanimously. I say that there were a few negatives, but it also passed in the House in March of 1972. As always, when you get into a political situation, there are drastic differences between the House version and the Senate version. So they got together, worked out the differences, and then passed both houses, 366 to 11 in the House and 74 to 0 in the Senate, with the objective at that time to restore and maintain the natural, physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And that Senate Bill 2770 ultimately became known as the Clean Water Act. Now, President Nixon was the president at that time. He put together a council to come up with some recommendations on environmental responsibilities. And out of that came some responsibilities for EPA. This organization would permit response to environmental problems in a manner beyond previous capability of government pollution control programs. Here are some of the things that would be accomplished by this council and by this EPA. The EPA would have the capacity to do research on important pollutants and the impact of these pollutants on the environment. Together, the EPA would monitor the condition of the environment, the biological as well as the physical and chemical, with data. Also, the EPA would be able, in concert with the states, to set up and enforce standards for air and water quality and for individual pollutants. Also, states could develop and expand their own pollution control programs, because many states had pollution control programs at that time. On October the 18th, 1972, the amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act were passed by Congress, overriding President Nixon's veto. You saw the picture that was showed up there with Nixon, and everybody thought Nixon signed that legislation. He didn't. He vetoed it. His reason for vetoing it was the price tag was too high, about $25 billion at that time. Also unique about this, overriding a veto is usually successful about 30% of the time. So it was very fortunate that they were able to override that veto and have the Clean Water Act. Now, let me digress for just a minute on a personal note. Some of you have heard of the Water Pollution Control Federation, now known as the Water Environment Federation. They were having their annual meeting in Atlanta 50 years ago today. Joe Lanez was the president, outgoing president of the Water Pollution Control Federation. And one of the benefits of being the outgoing president was to stay in the presidential suite at the Convention Hotel, which in this case was the Hyatt Regency in Atlanta. I was fortunate enough that year to attend that convention, and I also stayed in the Hyatt Regency. Quite unexpectedly, President Nixon decided he wanted to hold a political rally. So he picked Atlanta to hold that political rally. Now, it was kind of a little bit unusual for a president, he was a Republican, to come to Atlanta to hold a presidential rally, because back then the South was not too hospitable to the Republican cause. Well, guess what? Nixon and his wife decided they wanted the presidential suite. So President Joe and his wife had to move out. I had to move out of the hotel for 2 nights until Nixon and his entourage left. So it's amazing sometimes what you run into. But nevertheless, they got through that. And when President Joe and his wife moved back in the room, they found the red telephone still in that room that was left there by Nixon and his group. Now, I say that to tell you that sometimes things get changed and they get changed in a hurry. The amendments known as Public Law 92-500 created the National Permit Program to control discharge of pollutants into the nation's waters. And these permits are known and have been known as the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Some people make an acronym out of that and call it the NIPD's permit or NPDES permit. But nevertheless, that's what that Clean Water Act did. It replaced the old permit system that was instituted under the authority of the 1899 Refuse Act. The program was one part of a comprehensive effort initiated by the 72 law to prevent, reduce, and eventually eliminate water pollution. And made reference to that when she was talking about those slides and about the goals of the act. Now, what did these amendments, what were some of the things that it did? Well, it established the basic structure for regulating pollutant discharges into waters of the U.S. It gave EPA the authority to implement pollution control programs, such as setting wastewater standards for industry. Those are the right industrial permits, know about the pulp and paper categorical limits, or the metal plating industry, or the others, but many of those, and that's what this legislation did. It also maintained existing requirements to set water quality standards for all the contaminants in surface waters. It made it unlawful for a person to discharge any pollutant from a point source discharge. And there was a lot of controversy at one time about the definition of a point source discharge. The other thing it did was it funded construction of sewage treatment plants under the Construction Grants Program. And it recognized the need for planning to address critical problems posed by non-point source pollution. Now, Ann went over the goals of the Clean Water Act to make them fishable and swimmable by 1983. Now, keep in mind that the act was passed in 1972, so that's only 11 years that they wanted to do this, or thought that this Clean Water Act was going to clean up all the waters of the U.S. and gonna make them fishable and swimmable. And to have zero discharge by 1985, only 13 years. Now, if I ask you what they mean by zero discharge, I probably would get many answers. Are you talking about no water coming out the end of pipe? Or are you talking about water coming out of the end of the pipe with no pollutants in it? So what do you mean by zero discharge? Ann also alluded to the fact that in 1970, 2/3 of the nation's lakes, rivers, and coastal waters were unsafe for fishing or swimming, and untreated sewage was still being dumped in open water. Subsequent to the amendments, some things changed in the Construction Grants Program. Also in 1987, they phased out the Construction Grants Program and replaced it with the State Water Pollution Control Revolving Fund. This new funding strategy addressed water quality needs by building on EPA and state partnerships. Over the years, from 1972 till now, Many other laws have changed parts of the Clean Water Act. Title I of the Great Lakes Critical Programs Act of 1990, for example, put into place parts of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of 1978 that was signed by the U.S. and Canada, where the two nations agreed to reduce toxic pollutants in the Great Lakes. That law also required EPA to establish water quality criteria for the Great Lakes, addressing 29 toxic pollutants with maximum levels that are safe for humans. Now, keep in mind that the Act became effective October the 18th, 1972. But EPA did not issue the first municipal wastewater discharge permit until July the 30th of 1973. EPA and the state of Illinois issued that permit, and we're not told what the flow was in that permit, but it limited to 34 pounds of biochemical oxygen demand, 34 pounds of suspended solids, and 200 fecal coliform per 100 milliliters of water. Also, the city of Riverton, Illinois was required to conduct weekly effluent monitoring for those constituents. Now, let's come down to South Carolina. DHEC in the state of South Carolina submitted a request to EPA to administer the permit program. Even though the Clean Water Act established that each state had to seek authority or designation to issue permits. And that request was approved by EPA on June the 10th of 1975. Now, from 1972 to 75, EPA did issue some permits in South Carolina. Okay, but from 1975 forward, we have been issuing permits, NPDES permits, under that program. Also, if you've looked or ever read the Clean Water Act, their target was to get the major industrials first, to get the minor industrials second, to get the major municipals third, and the minor municipals and the privates fourth. And the final leg is the leg that we're now in. Non-point source, stormwater, CAFOs. Okay, that's where we at. Now, the Clean Water Act set up a two-step program for abating pollution from existing point source discharges. The first step was to be implemented by July the 1st of 1977, just 5 years, and called for industries to use best practical to control water pollution and publicly owned treatment plants to provide a minimum of secondary treatment. Also, the second part of that was to be implemented by July the 1st of 1983 and required industries to implement best available technology and publicly owned treatment plants to apply best practical technology. And privately owned domestic facilities were also required to use best practical technology. Clean Water Act, even though it's been in existence for 50 years, has had some controversies. Two specific aspects that I'll mention. One is the cost versus the benefit of the law. If you recall, I said one of the reasons Nixon vetoed that was he thought it was too high. But there has been countless numbers of other people that have criticized Congress and their legislatures over the amount of money that has been generated and given to the states to control pollution. The other thing that is controversial is an interpretation of waters of the United States, WOTUS. And as we speak, the current Supreme Court is looking at this again. Now, I said all of this to get to some success stories, and I mentioned to you that long list from 1968, all of which today have waste treatment facilities. Also, some of you in here old enough to remember Horse Creek and Langley Pond, Reedy River, used to be a different color each day. Turkey Creek, Santee Print Works used to discharge to that. And they used print, Varsol, kerosene, and other things to apply that print on clothes. And believe you me, if you got your clothes on there, you just well throw them away because you couldn't get the scent or the color out. The city of Columbia finally got around to putting in secondary treatment. Also, Charleston ended up with secondary treatment. And then there was a metal plating waste industry up in the upper part of the state that discharged to a small creek and then to Reedy River. And it had chromium being discharged, and it was a pretty yellow. Now, I've said all of this to say, well, what do we have left? Where do we go for the next 50 years? Let me give you some big picture items. One of which is agency restructure. That's been in the news, hadn't gone away, and we'll probably be faced with that again. The other thing is electronic submission of data. We want to go paperless. We've made a lot of progress, but we got a lot yet to do. Climate change. What are we already doing? What do we need to focus on? And another one, environmental justice. You've heard a little bit about that. What are the new available tools? And let me just share with you something that I found about environmental justice just last week. EPA has just established the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. And under that are the following offices: Office of Resource Management and Communications, Office of Community Support, Office of Policy, Partnerships and Program Development, Office of External Civil Rights Compliance. So that is an up and coming thing. And we need to be aware of that. That's going to be one of the challenges I see in the future. One of the other things, PFAS. And David's going to mention some more about PFAS, but let me just share with you. PFAS and other emerging contaminants. Okay? A group of scientists had developed a presumptive contamination model that found 57,412 sites across the U.S. are presumably contaminated with PFAS, including 49,145 industrial facilities, 4,255 waste treatment facilities, 3,493 current or former military sites, and 519 airports. While that sounds like a bit scary, there are over 57,000 presumptive contamination sites, and some people feel like that this is a gross underestimation. The scope of PFAS contamination is immense, and communities impacted by this contamination deserve swift regulatory action that stops the ongoing and future uses of PFAS while cleaning up the already existing contamination. And I found something else that about PFAS that I found very interesting. That someone has said there is a loophole in the federal government's procedures for reviewing new chemicals, and they have allowed at least 600 so-called forever chemicals into the American market, despite evidence that they pose serious health risks, according to a petition that has been filed. So we don't know all about PFAS yet. All we know is that it is a very significant risk and pose a significant risk to us. I haven't verified this, but someone shared with me that the little things you clean your teeth with the little cloth in there, is covered with PFAS. So you may want to look at that. All right. So where do we go from here? In a report from the Environment America Research and Policy Center and the U.S. Public Interest Research Group Education Fund, they say that pollution is still a problem 50 years after the Clean Water Act. They reported that nearly 194 million pounds of contaminants were discharged into U.S. waterways in 2020, and 1/3 of the local watersheds were affected. And those watersheds were in states like Texas, Indiana, Virginia, and 7 other states. And those states had over half of all those toxic discharges. In closing, I would like to quote from Dave Gaddis. Dave Gaddis is the CEO and general manager of DC Water. Mr. Gaddis says, in the 50 years since the passage of the Clean Water Act, we have accomplished so much in pursuit of clean drinking water, environmental justice, and the reduction of chemical sewage and combined sewer overflows to our rivers and waterways. While there is much progress to celebrate, there are also new critical challenges for our sector to address. The truth is, we're at a new inflection point, similar to the one that sparked the creation of the Clean Water Act 50 years ago. Our rivers are no longer burning, but today's challenges are similar in nature and no easier than they were decades ago. Our cities and their aging infrastructure are more vulnerable as climate changes accelerate. Our Supreme Court appears poised to roll back some environmental protections at the time when emerging threats such as PFAS and other forever chemicals and microplastic must be addressed. Our communities and water utilities across the country, already reeling from aging infrastructure, are also faced with choosing between lead pipe and service line replacements. With such bitter division in our Congress, corporate and utility leadership matter more than ever to meet the evolving needs of the communities that we serve. Funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs represents unique opportunity for all of us. Closing 2 comments. One is a question. Are all the waters of South Carolina today, October the 18th, 2022, fishable and swimmable? If not, we still have a lot of work to do. And now, one other comment from the Water for People organization that says approximately 2.2 million lack access to safe drinking water every day, and approximately 4.2 million lack access to safe sanitary facilities every day. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you something about the Clean Water Act, its history, the work that we've done, and the work that we have left to do. And if you're not a member of a national or state environmental association, I would recommend you join that and help you to develop your professionalism and your career. Thank you.